Hey everybody, welcome back to part 3 of this accent table build. In this video I'm going to show you how I made the skirt for this table. This is a pretty interesting process. The skirt's going to be made up of 4 different layers of 1/8 inch thick walnut, and it's done that way so I can get a bend in it. So what I'm going to do is take these thin layers of walnut, glue them up over a round form, and then when that glue dries it'll hold those pieces of walnut in that shape. Then I got to take it, cut some dovetail tails in the ends of it, and then slide them into the legs that I made in the previous video. So this is going to be a pretty fun project. I've done something similar to this before, but nothing quite this small and this intricate. So anyway, follow along. Let's do this thing.
So, first things first, I have to make the form for the skirt to get clamped up to. In order to do that, I need to know what my radius is going to be on the inside edge of the skirt. So to do that, I had to do some measuring and a little bit of math. So I know that this edge here on the tabletop is 16 inches in diameter, so that's an 8-inch radius. The back edge of the skirt is going to sit back 3/16 of an inch. So after a little bit of math, I come up with this 7 13/16 radius. That'll give me the perfect radius to get that skirt to sit right here in the middle. It's going to sit inside of the top edge instead of outside of it like I was originally thinking it was going to. But I think this actually look a little bit better. So anyway, off making the skirt.
So the first part of making the master template for the form starts with a piece of 3/4 inch MDF I had laying around. I then set up a circle cutting jig for my router and mounted that near the corner of the sheet. If you recall in the first video, I left out the part where I cut the ring out of the mitered pieces of wood. This is the same process I used to do that. Once the jig is set up, I just kick on the router, drop the bit down, and get to cutting. I made sure I was careful not to cut beyond a 90-degree arc here because I wanted the end of the form to be flat so that the ends of the strips of walnut could be clamped down without too much stress. Once that was done, I took the MDF to the table saw and ripped it to 9 inches wide, and then cross-cut that piece into 5 9x9 squares, and then took the master template over to the bandsaw to trim off the excess left by the router. That piece was then cleaned up on the router table with the same flush trim bit. Now that the master template is cleaned up, I placed it on top of the remaining pieces and traced out the profile, and then cut them out on the bandsaw. Then it was back to the router table to flush all those pieces up to the master template. On the first piece I noticed I had a burr pop up and realized that the router bit had begun to walk out of the collet. Thankfully I caught this before the bit was launched into orbit in my shop. Now, word of caution if you've never used MDF like this. It's incredibly versatile stuff, but the sawdust the stuff produces is horrible. It's super fine, gets everywhere, and I swear it's mixed with sandpaper because anywhere your clothing is rubbing or is tight, you're going to start feeling some irritation. Once all the pieces were trimmed up, it was time to glue them up. I just ran a couple beads of glue near the edge and then shot a few brads into it to hold it while the glue dries. Once the glue was dry, I ran it over the belt sander to clean up the face of any glue and any minor misalignment. Then it was over to the bandsaw to cut out the back. This was done so that the clamps have a place to grab a hold of. And instead of just cutting an arch in here, I made sure to cut in flats. Otherwise the clamp would just want to walk around as I began to tighten them up. Then it was time to finally start working on the actual skirt. I figured I'd need about 18 inches of material to go around the face of the form and to give it a little bit of hangover. I started with a large chunk of 8/4 rough sawn walnut and then cut it to 36 inches in length so I could deal with one long piece rather than 2 short ones. Then took that piece over to the jointer to square up one face and one edge, and then ran it through the planer to get the faces parallel. I forgot to film this next part, but after the planer I ripped this piece down to 3 inches on the table saw. Now off to the bandsaw. I set the fence to about 3/16 of an inch, which allowed me to reduce the number of strips I needed, but was still thin enough that they would still bend around the form. As you can see, they do still bend, but they're pretty stiff. After the bandsaw, I was left with 12 strips that needed to be cleaned up and made uniform, so a few trips through the planer did the trick. Once they were all cleaned up, it was time to trim them up to 18 inches and get ready to start gluing them. I started by applying a heavy coat of Titebond 3. I made sure to put enough on there so that the glue wouldn't set too fast and to also fill any small gaps that might pop up during the clamping. Then it was time to clamp it up and burn out those forearms. Started in the middle and then used clamps on the ends to start drawing the ends back like a bow. Now because clamps only have so much travel, I had to use a quick clamp to hold the ends in place as I took the first clamp off and reset it. This process continued over and over and over until the workpiece began to contact the form. As new sections of it came into contact with the form, I would add clamps to keep those areas down. One thing to be careful of here, besides the immense tension that is stored up in that wood, is to use blocks to spread out the force of those clamps. If you don't, the face of the wood will tend to cup outward and you'll end up with the Pringles chip shape instead of a nice flat curve. Once it was finally clamped up and my forearms were completely done, I let it set to cure overnight. This is one glue up you definitely don't want to rush. The next morning I came out to pop off the clamps and sure enough, it held its shape. I got a little more spring back than expected, but it wasn't enough to cause me to scrap it. I think if I had gone with a thinner strip it would have reduced it, but they still look pretty good. Now this first glue up did have some slight issues that needed to be worked out. The first layer ended up sliding up a bit, which caused me to have to clean up the edges and re-square it. I started by running it through the table saw, but immediately realized this was a really bad idea. Not only was it extremely dangerous, but the blade tear out was causing large splinters to form on the edge. So the second side was done in the bandsaw, which had a much better result. Once the skirt was cleaned up, it was time to get them cut to their final length. Started by flipping the tabletop over and placing the legs in their exact positions and numbering them so that each leg goes with this specific skirt. I then traced around them and marked the centers. The skirt was then laid onto the table and the marks for the edges of the legs were transferred up to the skirt. That mark was then extended all the way around the skirt. Then I needed to mark out the ends of the dovetails that protruded into the legs. So I measured out another ½ inch and repeated the process of extending the lines around the skirt. Then it was off to trim it. This first cut was critical as it not only sets the final length of the skirt, but it sets the square face of the dovetail sides will be marked from. So I made certain I was cutting right on the edge of that line and kept dead straight doing it. Then it was back to the bench to mark out the dovetails. This was pretty tricky because there isn't really much material for the protractor to register against, so I really took my time here to make sure I get this right. Then it was back to the vise to start cutting the dovetail out. The first cut is down the shoulder with my pull saw, and I stopped just short of the scribe lines. Then out comes the chisel to start taking down the cheeks of the dovetail. What made this a bit tricky is the chisel wanted to stay inside those glue lines, so I had to be patient and careful not to cut off too much or start going offline. And after a lot of back and forth checking and measuring, I was able to finally get the skirt slid all the way down into the leg. It still took a bit of persuasion with the help of a 2x4, but it went home. I'd rather this joint be a bit tight as I can always take off more later. It's not perfect, but it still holds tight. It looks pretty good. Now to just repeat this process for the remaining 3 skirts.
Well, thanks for watching. That's it for this video. Next video will be the completion of this table. If you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button, and if you like this video, hit the like button as well. You can also follow me along on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for watching. See you next time.